Welcome to another Jabba's Palace roll call. Today's character, Amanaman. Amanaman was an Amani headhunter slash bounty hunter who apparently liked using traditional weapons over things like blasters. And he also liked to keep trophies of some of his kills on his staff. But beyond that, we know almost nothing about the character, and like many other characters in this series, his screen time can be measured in seconds. I wouldn't blame even people who have seen Return of the Jedi multiple times for not noticing him at all. There's really only one scene where he's not in the background, and that's when Han Solo is revealed to be on Jabba's wall, still frozen in carbonite. So naturally, the audience's attention is drawn toward him rather than to the alien standing on the right side of the screen. Let's take a look at that shot one more time with the exposure adjusted so we can see a little bit better in the dim light of Jabba's palace. You can see Amanaman kind of look over his shoulder almost, looking back at Han in carbonite. Then we have a reaction shot from C-3PO, and after that we see a shot of what appears to be Amanaman laughing along with Salacious Crumb and the other aliens, and that's pretty much the extent of his performance in the film, although we do get glimpses of him in other places, such as right here. You can see him behind the Gamorrean guard between Han and Leia. You can barely tell he's there. But if we skip ahead just a second, you can see when they take Han away that you can definitely see his staff and his arm there behind them. And for just a split second, when they bring Leia forward, you can see his entire face there. Let's reverse that just a second so we can see it more clearly. There he is. I think his only other appearance in the film is when they are bringing Luke and Han before Jabba after Luke had killed the Rancor. There he is behind Han. That's actually maybe the best shot we get of him in the film. Let's look at it again. If you compare his height to that of Luke or Han, you can see he's roughly human-sized. And you also get a nice view of his staff with the skull trophies there. And you can also see him there in the background, just sort of swaying a little bit for some reason. And I think that's all you see of him in the film. As far as I know, he wasn't on the sail barge or the skiffs, so he's completely absent from the second half of the Jabba's Palace sequence. But that also meant that he probably survived after the sail barge was destroyed. Now, there are a lot of blink and you miss them kind of characters in Jabba's palace, but Amanaman is a little bit different because he was one of the few palace aliens that Kenner decided to make an action figure out of for their vintage action figure line. This is the American Power of the Force version, which came with a metal coin, and this is the European Tri-Logo version. The figure was also included in the second version of the Jabba the Hutt Dungeon Action playset, which reminds me I really need to make a video about that sometime. The vintage Amanaman figure is really quite unique compared to most of the other figures in Kenner's vintage line. It comes with a staff, which we'll look at in just a minute, and it has these very long articulated arms that stand out way in front of him. They are only articulated at the shoulder, though, and that makes them rather difficult to pose with. His legs are also articulated at the hip, but his tail is fixed in place and kind of gets in the way if you try to do much in the way of posing him. Although he doesn't use very many paint colors, they do a pretty impressive job with the paint here. The green is the paint, while the yellow is the color of the plastic. His face is kind of endearing in the way that only Kenner Star Wars figures can be. His staff, by contrast, is a little bit horrifying with 3 disembodied heads, a couple of them obviously shrunken, and a cut-off hand. It's a little surprising that Kenner allowed this to be on their figure, but it's accurate. It's also very hard to pose with, as you can see here. Part of it is that mine is bent for some reason, and I think that's a common problem with these staffs, but it is not easy to get him to hold this in any position. I've tried several, and this seems to be the easiest one. As I mentioned a little bit ago, each of the Power of the Force versions of Kenner's action figures came with these aluminum coins that were specific to the character. So here we have Amanaman's coin with a nice little portrait on the front and a little bit of text on the back. It says, "Long-armed creature at Jabba's court called Headhunter because of his staff with 3 heads." Well, yeah. So that figure was released in 1984, and we had to wait until 2001 to get the next Amanaman figure in the Power of the Jedi line. It's probably worth looking at the little snippet of information on the back here. The bounty hunter Amanaman lurked in Jabba the Hutt's den of crime in The Return of the Jedi, It scours the galaxy hunting down fugitives and keeps their skulls to decorate its staff. The species is called Amanin, but is nicknamed Headhunters. By the way, for those of you keeping score at home, a single member of his species is called Amani, whereas the species in general is called Amanin, apparently. Here's the figure itself, and it's actually quite well done. In addition to the small Salacious Crumb figure, which I don't have here, he came with 2 accessories, which we'll look at in just a second. But if we look at the figure itself, you can see that he's a bit more finely detailed than the vintage figure, and his paint is a little bit more detailed as well. A little bit smaller, though, than the vintage figure, which, to be fair, I think was slightly larger than it needed to be. One thing you'll notice right away is that the new figure has ball-jointed shoulders, which gives him a lot more freedom of movement and posing compared to the original figure, although they are quite long and unwieldy. He also has wrists that you can turn. The legs, like the vintage figure, are articulated, but the tail is still fixed in place, so it's of limited use. If we look at the staff, you can see that it's made up of relatively bendy plastic as opposed to the relatively hard plastic of the vintage figure staff, but I will say that the vintage figure staff is hands down more scary looking, I think. The new one looks almost a little bit cartoony, but it does have better paint job, to be sure. And he also comes with an entire skeleton minus the head, which is certainly one of the more interesting accessories in the modern Star Wars line. I don't think this is actually from the movie, though. These 2 figures are all that Kenner or Hasbro have made in terms of Amanaman action figures, but they did make one generic Amanin figure that was released in a comic 2-pack in 2009, and it was a little bit different than the original figure. As you can see here, they weirdly gave him humanoid-looking feet, and he was a lot bigger as well. I didn't really like this figure all that much and never picked one up. And in any case, it's not the same character as the one that was in Jabba's palace. The only other Amanaman figure that I'm aware of was released in 2010 by Medicom Toy, which is a Japanese company. They released it as part of their line of Kubrick figures, which are sort of Lego-inspired figures. This was part of an entire Jabba's Palace wave that they released. He's actually got a surprising amount of articulation, although his arms do come off fairly easily. Thankfully, they pop back on. His wrists are cut so that they will turn, and he's got articulated legs as well. Of course, the tail is fixed in place as usual. He's actually the only Amanaman figure with an articulated head that can even come right off if you prefer. It would be nice if Lego would actually release an Amanaman figure, but I don't see that happening anytime soon. I don't know if you can call this an action figure exactly. This is a custom figure that was made by John Sukup, otherwise known as Kettle Art. It's basically just a piece of wood, and he has a whole line of figures like this that are just very simple wooden shapes with painting on them. This was made in 2014. And it was originally on a kind of repurposed card back from an action figure, but the bubble fell off in shipping, and I kind of like having it to display with the rest of my Jabba's Palace figures that he made for me. By the way, if you want to see those figures at some point, maybe I should make a video about them. Let me know in the comments if you're interested in something like that. But if you want to know what the ultimate Amanaman collectible is, I would say this is probably it. This is the Gentle Giant Amanaman mini bust, although it's not that mini. Compared to most of their other busts, it's quite large. Both the paint and sculpt work are very well done on this. This was only made available to Gentle Giant's Premier Guild members in 2018, although it wasn't actually delivered until 2019. And it was one of 500 pieces made. If I had to make a complaint about it, I would say that the yellow portions of the skin are a little bit too dark. They've gone a little bit aggressive with the shading there, perhaps, but it's a great looking piece overall. So I would call this, as I said, the ultimate Amanaman collectible, unless, of course, you happen to have extremely deep pockets and a lot of room to display things in your collection, in which case you could go for this thing I found on eBay, which is a life-size Amanaman statue for over $4,000. I'm not a big enough fan of Amanaman to get this myself, but it does look pretty well made, actually. Well, that's pretty much what they've made for Amanaman. It's a surprising amount in some ways, given that he only appeared on screen for a matter of seconds, but his prominent placement in Kenner's action figure line had a lot to do with that, I believe. The fact that so much merchandise exists for such a minor character is one of the things that I love about Star Wars. Thanks for watching this very belated episode of Jabba's Palace Roll Call, and I hope to make more of them in the relatively near future.